Hey guys, so welcome to part 33 in this SQL Server / T-SQL tutorial playlist. Today we'll be looking at constraints in SQL Server. So let's dive right in, and we can begin by figuring out what exactly are constraints and why do we need them. So putting it simply, constraints in SQL Server are sort of predefined rules that you can enforce on single or multiple columns in a table, or you can even enforce them on the entire table in some cases. So these rules help us to maintain the integrity, reliability, and accuracy of data stored in these tables. So that's why we need these specific rules. So constraints help us to know that data that is being inserted into the table always has to match the rules we had set out or the criteria that we had specified in the form of constraints. And only if they satisfy these constraints will they be inserted into the database or whatever storage you're using. And if the data doesn't fit into the constraints or rules, the insert statement is aborted with an error message. So in other words, the data doesn't get inserted. So I've just put the syntax for a basic create table command with the syntax of how you can specify constraints on specific columns while creating a data table. So the next question to look at is how are they created? So how are constraints created? So there are basically two opportunities for us to create constraints. One is when we create a table for the first time. At the time of creation, we can specify constraints, which is what the syntax I had shown you in this previous slide was. So you can see when the create table statement is being used, we can specify the constraints for each for each column in the table. And also we can use an alter table statement and specify constraints on columns or the entire table much after the table has been created, and that is the other way of creating constraints on columns in tables. So before we proceed, I just want to ask you guys to quickly subscribe to this channel and like this video if you're finding it helpful. Most of our viewers are not subscribed, so it would be a great help to us if you could quickly subscribe and like this video. So now let's look at a list of constraints. There are 6 major constraints that are commonly used in SQL Server. These include the not null constraint, the unique constraint, a primary key constraint, foreign key constraint, check constraints, and default constraints. So I'll be diving deep into each of these constraints in the coming videos, and I'll be giving you a demo of how they are implemented and the variations of how you can use them. So if you're subscribed, you'll be able to know when these videos come out, or they must be already out depending on the time if you're watching. So I'll just give you a brief overview of each of them, starting with the not null constraint. So when we specify a not null constraint on a column, we are enforcing a rule on that column, which means it cannot accept null values. So basically, in SQL Server, by default, a column can hold null values, but with this not null constraint enforced, it means that you cannot insert a new record or update a record without adding a specific value to this field. So it cannot be null. If it is null, you will get that error while inserting or updating the data. So that's the not null constraint. Then we come to the unique constraint, which ensures that all values in a column are different. So this is similar to the primary key constraint, which we'll be looking at next, which guarantee that each piece of data in the column or set of columns, depending on how you're specifying the constraint, has to be unique. It provides a guarantee of this uniqueness. So a primary key constraint basically is automatically holds a unique constraint within it. So if you're specifying a primary key, you don't need to specify the unique constraint. However, in a table, you can have only one primary key constraint, but unlike the primary key, you can have multiple unique constraints per table. And also it's important to note that specifically in SQL Server, the unique constraint allows one null value. And I've just put the syntax in here. This is a basic table persons, and we want IDs to be unique. So we specify the unique keyword after the not null. And then I'll be diving deeper into these constraints with the demos in the upcoming videos. So you can check out the playlist to get a full list and watch those videos to see implementation and demonstrations of these constraints. We've got the primary key constraint. So the primary key constraint uniquely identifies each record in a table. So each row of data can be uniquely accessed by the record stored in the primary key. So primary keys must contain unique values and they cannot contain null values. So a primary key by default will have a not null and a unique constraint attached to it, but only one column in a table can be a primary key. So that is why we also have the unique and null constraints available to us. So in this code sample, I've specified a primary key for the ID column of persons, because that would be the only column which had unique values as opposed to last name, first name, and age. I've also added a not null, but it's not necessary since the primary key also contains not null constraint within it, or the functionality of a not null constraint within it. Next, we've got a foreign key constraint, and the foreign key constraint is used to prevent actions that would destroy links between tables. So basically a foreign key in one table, or the data in a foreign key in one table would point or refer to the primary key column in another table. So that table with the foreign key would be called the child table, and the table with the primary key is called the referenced or parent table. So there is a link created between a foreign key column in one table, or the child table, and the primary key column in the parent table. And the foreign key constraint helps us to prevent actions that would destroy the links between these two tables. And unlike the primary key, it can accept null values. So I've got a code sample with the creation of a table orders with the order ID, which is the primary key, order number, and person ID, which is the foreign key that references the person ID column in the parent table, which has the name persons. So that's a little bit about the foreign key. Next we come to the check constraint, which is used to limit the value range that can be placed in a column. So basically, if you define a check constraint on a column, it will only allow certain values for this column that fit the criteria that you have specified. And I've given you an example using the same persons table that we've been using in the past few demos, code samples. And here I've specified a check constraint on the age column and given it a criterion that the age must be greater than or equal to 18. So that's just a high level overview of the check constraint. Watch the full video on the check constraint to see further use cases and more complex use cases of the check constraint. Next, we've got the default constraint, which is used to set a default value for a column if no other value is specified. So it sort of is the antithesis of the not null, wherein it doesn't prevent columns that do not specify values for a specific field. It rather sets a default values for those columns which have not specified any field or any value. So for this example, I've created a table persons and I've added a column city and given it a default constraint wherein it would insert the city London whenever no city is specified while data is being inserted. So that's a bit about the default constraint. And yeah, this was just a high level overview of the major constraints in SQL Server. In the next few videos, I'll be taking a deeper dive into each of these constraints along with an implementation and a demonstration. So make sure you are subscribed for that. Once again, thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, comment, and hit the bell icon. I'll see you in the next one.